So thank you for being here and sharing your expertise with everyone. It looks like we've got a robust list of people in attendance. And because we want to keep this to time, I'll start by introducing myself and then ask everyone to introduce themselves. I'm Liz Chapman, pronouns she, her. I am the Executive Director of Recycle Colorado. And what we are doing today is exploring some of the information that our policy committee needs to make a decision about whether or not Recycle Colorado wants to advance some type of producer responsibility legislation related to batteries and or household hazardous waste. And so we've asked this panel of experts here to share with us the lessons learned, how it works in other places, what we should keep in mind if we want to pursue this sort of thing, what you would do differently, just trying to pick your brain so that we can make an informed decision. The policy committee will be evaluating in September 3 different propositions about legislative priorities for 2025. And this conversation today helps us inform our overall membership and our policy committee specifically about what it would look like if we wanted to keep going in this direction. So thank you very much for helping us make that decision. And I am going to ask Christina to introduce herself.
Thanks, Liz. I'm Christina Seibert. I'm the Executive Director for the Solid Waste Agency of Northern Cook County in Illinois. And I also am a member of the Illinois Product Stewardship Council, and I am a member of the PSI Board of Directors. We passed a bill in Illinois this year that I will talk about when we get to my part of the agenda. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Christina. I'll ask Jen to introduce herself, please.
Hey there, this is my name is Jen Holliday. I'm with the Chittenden Solid Waste District. It's a local regional solid waste district in Vermont. I'm also the chair of the Vermont Product Stewardship Council and a member of the Product Stewardship Institute Board of Directors. And we worked on EPR for batteries and household hazardous waste the last session and passed both EPR laws that I'll talk about.
Thank you so much. I'm going to ask Leland now.
Hi, my name's Leland Rehard. I'm a policy and programs manager with the Product Stewardship Institute. I'm also on the Missouri Product Stewardship Council and the current chair of the Missouri Solid Waste Advisory Board. Thanks, Liz.
I can't hear Liz. Can you guys hear Liz?
No, I was muted. The space bar thing was not working. So Jodi, please.
So my name is Jodi Tomchyshyn London. I am with a small consultancy out of Canada called JTL Squared Consulting. I'm coming up on 25 years of experience in the waste EPR, waste policy realm. And I also serve as a director on the board of directors of the Recycling Council of Alberta. And I've been asked to talk to you today and provide an overview of HHW regulation across Canada.
Thank you so much, Jodi. Nick, can we go to you for an introduction, please?
Hey, Nick Lapis with Californians Against Waste. We're an environmental organization based in Sacramento, working on waste reduction recycling policy. There are not 3 of me. I asked a couple of our staff people to attend, and I didn't realize I sent them the panelist link instead of the attendee link. So sorry about that. Well, I'll find the other link for them.
Thank you so much. So, jumping from meeting to meeting, I have misplaced the agenda. Allie, do you have that handy?
Liz, I think you had Shelley talking next for a couple of minutes. And then Leland is after that.
I am the real Nick. And Allie, I don't see Shelley in our panelists.
Yeah, she didn't think that there'd be time, but if we'd like her to, I can switch her over to chat real quick.
Yeah, I think it would be great to give the Colorado context from
Okay, I just added her.
and Allie, could you put the attendee link in the chat? I only have the host link.
Yep.
Sorry, Shelley. Would you introduce yourself and kick us off with how are things in Colorado in the
Yeah,
battery
sorry everyone.
and
I'm
household
Shelley
hazardous
Fuller.
waste?
I manage the Boulder County Household Hazardous Waste Facility in Colorado. And I really did try to get like a Colorado landscape and ask all the HHW programs across the state to give us some info. Thank you to the 6 programs that gave us some information. The numbers are kind of sad, to be honest. We're probably serving about 3% of the households across the state of Colorado. So I think hopefully we can learn a lot today about EPR and batteries. I think the positive note is that, let me put my notes because I didn't think I was talking today, sorry. I think with some of the offsite events and our permanent HHW programs, we collected 229,922 pounds of batteries. So that doesn't include some of the HHW programs that didn't throw in their information yet, but at least we're making a little bit of progress in some places. So that is the terrible update that I have for you all.
Thank you, Shelley. And so I have found my agenda, which means Leland, we're going to ask you to give us that broad picture that Product Stewardship Institute is so good at translating.
Well, I will do my best. Can you hear me okay, Liz? Great, thank you. Let me go ahead and just fire this up. Hopefully everyone can see that okay. Well, thank you for having me. My name is Leland Rehard, the Product Stewardship Institute. It's going to give a very big high-level overview of battery EPR and household hazardous waste EPR in the U.S. You've got some great folks on after me to talk specifically about some of the state programs like Vermont and Illinois, as well as Jodi to talk about Canada. So I'll try to breeze through that since you'll get a lot more information from them. Let's start with battery EPR. This map's a little busy, and that's because battery EPR is busy in the U.S. right now. There's currently 10 laws plus the 10 states plus the District of Columbia. The ones to really pay attention to are the ones highlighted in kind of that orange. Those are recently passed bills, and also blue, Illinois, which we're waiting for the governor to sign and anticipate that the governor will sign. We're going to add that one to the list as well. These reflect kind of the newer generation of battery EPR laws that include rechargeable batteries, primary batteries, and aren't determined by chemistry. Battery EPR laws are some of the oldest in the United States and some of the first, but the first ones are extremely limited, like the ones in Iowa, for example, on specific chemistries and types of batteries, and don't necessarily, when we think of battery EPR, they don't reflect what we think of now as a full, robust EPR program. I don't know if I need to spend too much time on why everyone's interested in battery EPR, but I'm sure as many folks on this call, you've probably experienced fires or the safety risks that come with batteries finding their way into our waste and recycling stream. There's also a loss of critical minerals as lithium batteries and other batteries proliferate in the marketplace. If anything that used to have a cord, you can now find it with a battery. There's a lot more batteries out there. And in the US, those current laws I spoke about, the older ones are extremely limited and narrow in their scope and don't reflect what we may consider the best practices for EPR now. And of course, EPR can provide economic opportunities for managing this waste better. And to that end, there's been a lot of great progress on battery EPR, and you'll get to hear from some of these states about some of that progress, with Vermont being the first to do primary. That's kind of the single-use disposable batteries in 2014. The District of Columbia being the first to take on rechargeable primary and embedded batteries in 2021. California built on that and added e-mobility, so e-bikes and scooters, as well as the District of Columbia with an amendment in 2022. And Washington was kind of the first state that had a bill that encompassed all of those batteries, as well as a study on what we call large format batteries. So the batteries used in your electric vehicles or battery energy storage systems. The easiest thing I can say is if you can, what the Tesla wall is, that's what we're talking about when we talk about BESS batteries. And also recently, New Jersey passed the first state EPR bill for electric vehicle batteries as well. And that was supported by the industry too. And pretty soon I'll get to add Illinois on here, but you'll hear a lot more from Christina on Illinois. These bills are all really recent, at least the ones that are more encompassing. And to that end, none of them have really been implemented yet. Vermont will be the first because they're building on an existing program, just amending to add rechargeable and other batteries. So you'll see a lot of these programs start to roll out 2027 and 2026. There's a lot of, besides just the issues that these batteries are causing in the waste and recycling stream, there's a lot of opportunities for pursuing battery EPR right now. There's a broad support and broad coalition that wants to see EPR managed batteries from brands, haulers, recyclers, governments, fire departments, and all sorts of other folks who are interested in seeing these out of the waste and recycling stream and handled in a more responsible manner. There's existing bills and a framework that PSI has helped develop for creating an EPR bill. You don't just have to do it from scratch. The EU, as always, has blazed the way on EPR with programs in the EU that cover virtually all batteries and have very robust stipulations for responsible end markets and very specific material recovery targets and other performance standards. And the way that support or that opportunity looks like in the US is the industry support, especially, and who that's coming from is the Portable Rechargeable Battery Association, or PURBA. There used to be a lot of associations for the battery manufacturers. It's kind of really coalesced around PURBA, and they are supportive of trying to use EPR to manage the issues that their members' products cause in the waste and recycling stream. And Called Recycle, the PRO for the batteries, has been around for a long time, and they can provide that real deep technical expertise of all the regulations and things that people need to think about when trying to pass one of these bills, the nitty-gritty of collection, transportation, and processing. And the way they've been providing this support is engaging in dialogue with organizations, groups, and associations that are interested in bringing battery EPR to their state. They will lobby, they will look for a sponsor, and they will provide testimony and be, a key player in a battery EPR initiative if a state's interested. And how they do that is, well, in some states, they've just gone out and found a legislator and put forth a bill. In states that have been more successful, they've looked for a core group of stakeholders, so groups in that state who are very interested in seeing us push forward. It helps give an opportunity to engage in a dialogue with that industry association. While it's great that they are supportive, everything that they want out of an EPR program may not be necessarily what a state wants out of that program. So it's important to have a group of folks in that state to advocate for what's important in their state and their members and what they need out of that battery EPR bill. PSI is currently doing that in Oregon with a group of local governments and haulers to help them have that conversation with the PURBA folks, Called Recycle, and other associations to make sure whatever battery bill they get, even though it's supported by the industry, that the things that they need are included in there as well. And also PSI, if you're a member, is hosting twice a month battery stakeholder calls for all of our members. And one of those calls each month, we invite the industry associations to join and to have these conversations about issues we're seeing in the bills, issues we're seeing in program implementation. This is a very rapidly changing product area. There's always new batteries and new issues that need to be considered. So it's great to have that opportunity for us to speak with them informally and figure out what's going on. So I want to briefly walk through Washington's law. They're not here, so I chose Washington. You'll hear from Illinois and others, just so you get a flavor of what's in, kind of an industry-supported EPR bill right now. So right now, the covered materials in Washington's law includes a broad scope of batteries from those primary AA batteries, rechargeable batteries, up to what we call medium format batteries. So you might consider these to be like your e-bike batteries or the batteries used in certain power tools like chainsaws, weed whips, all those new tools that have battery packs on them. They also included a study on large format batteries, those electric vehicles and battery energy storage systems. That study is included in other states' bills as well. They also include damaged and defective batteries as a covered material that can be collected. The one thing they do not include, and we'll be studying as well, is embedded battery devices, and we'll chat a bit more about the issues with that. They have performance goals for collection, recycling efficiency, and public awareness in Washington's program. They have strong measures for funding, so cost internalized. They have language for eco-modulation, not requirements, but language that encourages the PROs to pursue eco-modulation as far as how they charge their members or producers to pay for the program based on the design of the product, its ease of recyclability, and so on. And it also covers all the costs of the program, from collection, processing, transportation, oversight, all that stuff. Some other interesting elements, it does, like any good EPR program, have a minimum convenience standard. It also has strong environmental and equity justice language about serving overburdened communities. It requires a plan. The program plan that's submitted should be renewed every 5 years. And as I mentioned, it has that study for larger format batteries and embedded batteries. So in the world of batteries, there's certainly some ongoing issues out there in the US. We're having discussions about how to include embedded batteries. So these are batteries that you cannot easily take out of a device. So you think of vape devices, apparel, like your kids light up shoes, toys, certain toothbrushes, you name it. It's got a battery you can't easily take out of it. Who's responsible for that? Is it the device manufacturer? Is it the battery manufacturer? How do you collect those? Places that traditionally have collected batteries are not set up to collect electronic waste. For example, or vape devices that have a whole other layer with, a regulated substance like nicotine being inside them. So there's a lot of industry associations that have not been engaged in this conversation that do need to be engaged for embedded batteries. Some of them may or may not be resistant. Some of them we don't have experience with, like vape manufacturer associations. So there's a lot of things to be untangled. And that's a conversation we're starting in Oregon to figure out, all right, embedded battery devices make up a large portion of the batteries that are being found in the waste stream. We need to get those out if we actually want to solve this problem that batteries are causing. There's also been some opposition from certain battery recyclers, one in particular, Redwood, which is very large. Battery recycling for lithium batteries is new. It's kind of a growing industry, and they have some concerns with how EPR works and how they'll be able to operate in a state that's using EPR. So they've had some questions and raised some concerns in Connecticut and in some other states as well that have had EPR bills and laws that have passed. All right, I'm going to briefly go over HHW. We've got lonely little Vermont up there. We'll get to hear a lot more about why Vermont is a leader in EPR here pretty soon from Jen. But of course, very much like Shelley just reported with HHW, household hazardous waste is toxic. There's a reason we don't want it in the trash, but it's also extremely costly to manage. We did some work for Vermont when they were proposing their bill and estimated about that they spent $2.2 million per year in Vermont to manage household hazardous waste. We came up with a similar number when we studied Oregon Metro's cost of how much they would save with HHW EPR, and it's about $2 million per year. And many states lack any kind of collection infrastructure because of how expensive it is. Some states require it in every county. Others, like my home state of Missouri, so don't feel bad, Colorado, it's extremely limited here. I'd be surprised if we're even hitting 3% of the population having access. And access can just be a collection event once a year. It may not even be, it's certainly not a permanent site open 40 hours a week during regular business hours. That is not what it looks like in many states. So EPR can absolutely help with that as well. It can reduce improper disposal. If it's not convenient, folks are going to put it in the trash. Never mind if there's a cost barrier to them to take care of it. So it can certainly increase that collection convenience and awareness, reduce worker health and safety risk with managing this waste in your facilities if you do have one, and it absolutely can reduce the cost and reduce the liability of HHW entering landfills. So we worked with Cascadia Consulting to help come up with the $2 million per year that HHW EPR bill would save Oregon Metro. I'm not going to speak too much about Canada. We've got Jodi on here, so I don't want to put any words in the Canadian's mouth. He's already going to have a lot more experience with HHW, but it has been successful in Canada in many provinces. And it has also shown, a massive increase in the success of these programs since they've been implemented. You would expect to see these numbers of increase in collection volumes of 365%. In Missouri, it would be probably 1,000% because almost none of it is really collected if we started measuring what we currently can measure versus what can be achieved by a program that creates a robust, convenient statewide program. So, one of the questions is, why in the U.S. we don't have Vermont, who's been willing to, kind of step out there and take on this difficult program. One is it is difficult, and two, everyone thought that this was too big, but we've also taken on packaging, which is consuming many states who are interested in doing this kind of time and bandwidth. So I think HHW still lingering out there. Another potential reason is that some industries have created, kind of their own specific program, things that are traditionally collected in HHW, like batteries, paint, and gas cylinders. There's EPR programs specifically for those products out there already, which can seem easier to implement than trying to take on something with, thousands of manufacturers potentially, whereas gas cylinders really only has one manufacturer, at least for the 1 pound propane cylinders. So there's definitely some issues there. I would encourage folks, if they're, batteries, certainly there is great industry support. But in HHW, if you had to pass just 2 laws in a state for EPR, it would probably be packaging and HHW. You go after the volume and you go after the most toxic and dangerous substances in 2 bills and 2 programs. So with that, I'll just say if you've got questions for follow-up, I'd recommend reaching out to Scott Cassell, our founder, or Megan Modlin, who's taking over our battery work for connecting with our resources if you're interested in learning more. With that, I think we're going to save questions for later, Liz, so I'll go ahead and stop sharing my screen and turn it back over to you.
Thank you so much. We did have a question in the chat that Christina graciously answered, but thank you, Leland. I want to make sure we're giving everybody time. So you're correct. I'm making notes of some questions, and we'll make time at the end of everyone's presentation for questions. But if you have questions, feel free to use the chat function while people are talking. And with that great tee up from Leland, we're going to continue looking north and east up to Vermont and ask Jen to talk to us about their programs.
All right, do you see my screen? Can you hear me? Good. Okay, hi everyone. Thanks for asking me to speak to this group today about EPR in Vermont. It's something I'm super passionate about and I've been working on for quite a long time. My name is Jen Holliday. I've already introduced myself. I've been working on legislative initiatives since about 2007, and I also managed our household hazardous waste program for about 25 years. So I had a pretty good background in household hazardous waste to help toward the efforts of passing our legislation. So I think it's important to understand, sorry, I gotta get this slide to go, how solid waste is governed in Vermont to kind of understand how we got where we are with EPR in Vermont. This is a map of what we call solid waste management entities, or SWMEs for short, in Vermont, which were formed when a law was passed back in the 1980s requiring every city or town to have a solid waste implementation plan, or SWIP. And that was to make sure that municipalities were working on waste reduction and that they also were managing waste in an environmentally sound manner. And with that requirement, municipalities decided to join together, but there was no real mandate to join together. So it was done in a really random way. And so that's how we end up with this incredible map of patchwork of solid waste management entities, or some of them are alliances, some of them are groups, and they all have varying authority. So there are even some towns that didn't join any group, and there are those individual towns that are yellow in the map. So the Chittenden Solid Waste District, who I represent, is located up here in the northeast corner of the state. We're the largest solid waste district in terms of population. We serve about 165,000 residents, which is about 25% of the state's population. So I'm not going to talk about all of the mandates in the SWIP, but the one that's most relevant to today's conversation is the mandate that every municipality must have household hazardous waste collection services in the form of either a permanent program, or they must at least provide 2 collection events per year. That used to be actually 4 collection events per year, but it got so expensive that the state lowered that requirement because it was unaffordable. This has really resulted in quite a robust permanent collection system in the state. This was actually only 4 permanent collection programs back in 2017 or 18, but it's doubled to 8 permanent collection programs with 1 that's pending and 2 individual town collection programs. So really we have about 11 permanent facilities in the state that are run by certain SWMEs that you saw there on the map. So in Vermont, we have a fairly long list of EPR laws in place, which is the result of the work of the Vermont Product Stewardship Council, which we've worked on over the years. So I wanted to talk to you a little bit about the Product Stewardship Council because it's an important piece of how we have been able to pass legislation since 2008. We were formed in 2008 by most of the SWMEs on that map participating in the formation of the council. The membership is only local government or SWMEs. We don't allow any other voting parties in the group, but we do work very closely with the Product Stewardship Institute and the Agency of Natural Resources that participate in our meetings, and they engage on EPR initiatives, including legislation. So our work is guided by a product evaluation tool that helps us prioritize the products that we want to work on for EPR legislation. And this tool was one that I found and borrowed from the Canadian Council of Ministers of the Environment. It uses 4 criteria against the products that we're considering. What kind of impact that product has on the environment, the cost that that product is to local government to manage, the potential for resource recovery under an EPR program that isn't already happening with that product, and the political will and industry support if that is if that's positive. So it's a simple spreadsheet that our members fill out every 2 years or as needed, and that dictates what products we work on. So once we choose our products, we find a legislator that will sponsor a bill, and this is all through the Product Stewardship Council. We help draft the bill with that sponsor, with input from our partners such as PSI and the Agency of Natural Resources. And then we request to provide testimony for the hearings, and we provide data to help persuade legislators. And then our lobbyists will alert us when to send an email or call our legislators to support a bill. So the SWMEs are really engaged and really effective at telling their stories. Often we'll develop a 1-pager about the bill and send it with our individual communications to legislators, which is what's on the screen now. And that really helps them quickly understand what the problem is and why they should support it. So on this screen, we've got the 1-pager for both our rechargeable battery law and our HHW law that was passed in the year before last. And since that's what this group is interested in, I'll go into our HHW EPR bill a little bit. It was a priority for the Vermont Product Stewardship for many years. We started talking about it in 2017 when there was a multi-stakeholder process that was held by ANR to look at how to fund more HHW collection programs in the state. And the Vermont Product Stewardship Council at that time was also working on an EPR bill for HHW that was introduced in 2018, which was taken up and some hearings were held, and that resulted in questions that we needed to answer before we could attempt another bill. And that was the basis of the study that Leland referred to, that ANR commissioned with the Product Stewardship Institute to answer some of those questions, primarily around the cost of an EPR program if it were implemented in the state, and what kind of impact it would have on the producers, how many producers would be impacted, how many products would be included in the law, et cetera. So that was followed by numerous bills initiated by the Vermont Product Stewardship Council and introduced every biennium for the next 6 years, with H67 finally winning the gold, which was enacted into law last year. So I'll briefly go through some of the highlights of the bill. Covered products is a really important definition, of course, in the bill. And it's a little tricky to understand, so I'll explain it here. What it says is what's on the screen. It's a consumer product offered for retail sale in its original packaging. If the product has any of the following characteristics, and it basically refers to our hazardous waste regulations and the characteristics that would put it into hazardous waste regulations regardless of the status of the generator, because we are talking about consumer products which are generally not covered under hazardous waste regulations. But basically what it's saying is that if it exhibits the same characteristics as a hazardous waste, then it's a covered product regardless of who it's meant for or who generates it. So that's what's covered in the law, as well as gas cylinders. Exemptions, what's not covered in the law is anything that's already covered by an EPR program. And then also pesticides, because we have our Agency of Ag that partially funds pesticide disposal for the swimmies. Products intended to be applied to the human body, like makeup, sunscreen, nail polish, medical or industrial grade gas cylinders, or refillable gas cylinders. So SodaStream, larger propane cylinders that are refillable because they have a fairly good take back program. Who's covered or who can participate in the program is the covered entities, and that is important to understand because it's anyone that brings a consumer product that's a covered product under the program, any amount of that product, and it doesn't matter whether it is a business or a household, as long as it's not a large quantity or small quantity generator. So very small quantity generators are covered. So a business with, say, a spray paint that you can buy at Home Depot, that would be covered coming into the program. So we don't have to worry about who the generators are that are bringing materials into the program. This is the timeline. Next July, we will have a stewardship organization and a collection plan due. That happened because this past session, the producers asked for an extension on some of this law. The legislature was willing to give them a 6-month extension on the stewardship organization registration. It was January. So we're ending up with the registration and the collection plan due at the same time. The plan, I will point out that there may be more than one stewardship organization, but there can only be one plan. So if there's more than one organization, they have to work together and submit one plan. The law also has a landfill ban aspect to it, which goes into effect next July for any of those covered products. Just some highlights for the collection plan requirement. The program must allow any municipal household hazardous waste program to opt in. It must provide education and outreach to make consumers aware of the program and to reduce the hazardous waste that they're generating. A survey is required to determine 2 years after implementation to determine the effectiveness of that education and outreach. It must include all costs associated with collection. So in statute, it says labor, setup fees for the collection events, anything that's associated, packaging, anything associated with collection, they must include, as well as education, processing, and end-of-life management. And the performance goal. I heard your comment, Shelley, about 3%. It seems pretty low. Our facility, we're at around 12%, and we think that we're probably serving pretty much anybody that needs to use our program. There was a study that was done years ago by NAMA, the North American Hazardous Materials Management Association, and they determined that if you're around 12%, you're pretty much a gold star. You're serving the majority of your public. So 5% is higher than we are statewide. It doesn't seem high enough, but after 5 years, the producers have to propose the next performance goal, and hopefully that will go up. So over to batteries. I just threw this slide in a few minutes ago just because I wanted to show where we passed the primary battery law back in 2014. It was implemented in 2016. It did have a considerable impact on how much we were collecting, and it continues to grow. And with that, rechargeable batteries were also continuing to grow because of the popularity and introduction of lithium ion, which really wasn't around back in 2014 when we decided to pass the law for primary batteries. So in terms of primary batteries, the law was amended last year. The bill was passed last month. And it brings rechargeable batteries and battery containing products into that primary battery EPR law. The rechargeable batteries are all batteries less than 25 pounds and a watt rating of not more than 2,000 watt hours. So it'll cover scooters and e-bikes and lawn equipment, those types of materials. We did not include products that embedded batteries that are not easily removable to be collected, but it does bring in the battery containing products that are easily removable, which our initial primary battery law did not have. And it now includes a landfill ban for all batteries. And there is a study aspect to the bill, which Leland talked about. Some of the other states have. We're looking at hybrid and electric vehicle batteries and storage systems and batteries with embedded products, embedded in products. So I'll just finish up. Each battery stewardship plan needs to describe how municipalities, this was an important piece of the aspect that the local government made sure was in the bill, which was that we would be fairly compensated for our labor and collection costs, because if any of you do collect batteries, you know how much effort that is to sort the batteries, tape them, and safely package them for transportation. So that was something I wanted to point out in the bill that was important to us. And I think that's it for me.
Jen, thank you so much. And I appreciate you condensing what could easily be a 3-hour informational session to such a short amount of time. Same compliment to you, Leland. There were a couple of questions in the chat, since we're okay on time, that I thought might be great if we could capture your answers. One was, is A&R in Vermont allowed to advocate for bills at the legislature? Do they provide funding? How committed is the state government, or empowered are the agency leaders to support the efforts of the Stewardship Council?
Yeah, that's a great question. And that is the crux of why we don't allow anybody but local government to be part of the Vermont Product Stewardship Council, because it's very political. The agency is overseen by the governor, and that can go either way depending on who's governor. So they cannot generally advocate, or do not generally advocate for legislation, particularly these types of bills. I work with individuals on staff to make sure that whatever we have for a bill, before it gets finalized, that it will work with the agency, that it's not, that it's the best it can be in terms of working for the state of Vermont and how they would be able to oversee it, and if there were any issues with that. But they can't advocate, and the funding that they provide, they do have some money that they provide to the swimmies for HHW collection. It's probably about, I want to say like 10 or 15, 20% of what the total costs are for swimmies. So, but they don't provide any funding in terms of getting legislation passed. They funded the PSI report, when we have to understand more and get more data around problems that they want to help solve, they will fund studies.
And I'm assuming, Jen, with that answer, when you say problems that they need to help solve, problems that have been brought to their attention within state agencies, not, as you say, it's a state agency, and so they can't engage in anything that could be perceived as political, but they are tasked with serving requests made by local governments and citizens. Is that
right? So back to, this is why I got into the whole SWIP, back to the SWIP. The state is requiring us to do certain things, right? And so the response to that is, we can't afford to build these facilities. We can't afford to do this with, the amount of funds that we can generate with our community. So, so A&R hired PSI in that case to look at how much would it cost for an EPR program and to take over those costs. So it's a little, I would say it's a little bit, they work on the edge of issues, I would say. They push it where they can because they do want to help solve the problems, but they can't be seen as trying to go in any particular direction or advocating for a EPR solution.
And thank you. There was another question about if there must be one plan for the producer responsibility organization, is there any effort to coordinate with PROs for HHW that already exist in the state? And the example is paint care as an example. It seems like there could be efficiencies for both existing programs and the new one if they coordinate.
Right, there's no requirement. Paint is exempt because they already have their program, but that was the point. One of the examples we used when we talked about this during the legislative process was propane cylinders. They wanted to have a separate bill for themselves because they didn't want to be part of this PRO, and our response was, well, you can be your own PRO. You just have to coordinate, like you said, is going to make it more efficient because you're talking to the same collection points and it's just more efficient way to do things.
Sure. And the last question is, do you plan to have any permanent year-round facilities to collect HHW?
Yeah, 4 of those that were up on the 8, 4 of the 8 that were on the screen are already permanent year-round collection facilities. There's those collection facilities will take from out of their geographical community, so to speak. So Chittenden Solid Waste District, we have a permanent year-round facility, and we'll take materials from other areas, other residents. If they bring in covered products for, say, paint care, we will take that material for no cost. So we kind of share our facilities as much as we can. And I also forgot to mention a kind of a fun fact that I didn't really realize when we were working on the legislation, but I'm really happy this has resulted in that vape devices will be covered under this HHW law. So when you're talking about batteries, there's an overlap there. And that's because there's no way of, and I'm talking about the disposable one-use vape devices that have the embedded battery, because the nicotine cartridge there's no way to determine if that nicotine cartridge is completely empty. So when you go back to that definition of covered products, you have to assume that there is nicotine in it and it would be covered under the hazardous waste regulations.
Thank you. That disposable vape battery thing is none of us are pleased with that in the system. Well, thank you, Jen. And we can come back again. Please put your questions in the chat. Those that we've got time to answer in the moment, we will. And then we'll come back to any we don't get at the end. So I am going to turn it over to Christina to talk about Illinois. And Christina, I feel like you might be able to address the lingering question that's in the chat as part of your discussion, since you guys talked about embedded, the non-covered batteries and how that works out in your system.
Yeah, I sure can. I'm just going to try and get my screens set up here. All right. Is everybody seeing my presentation? Yes. Okay. So yes, I will answer that. Actually, I'm going to answer that question first, I think, just so that we don't forget about it. The question on covered batteries and embedded batteries, and who's responsible for batteries that end up in a collection that weren't considered a covered battery. And we've had a lot of discussions through the development of our bill, because we haven't gotten into implementation yet, of understanding where some of the challenges may be for a PRO operating a program once it's implemented, and knowing that there will be products that are going to slip in that weren't paid for. So Call to Recycle is the only battery stewardship organization that has emerged at this point, serving programs that are similar to the bill that we proposed and passed. And they've indicated that they use the information of the batteries that are collected to ensure that all the producers that are supposed to be paying into their program are in fact contributing. So there is one element there of an embedded battery that may be removed from a product that is now in the system that wasn't expected to be there. They may be able to identify it as one that wasn't paid for or accounted for in the system if it's labeled from a battery producer that isn't a registered producer in the program. Now, if it's a battery that is from an existing registered producer, there probably isn't a good way to tell that it was accounted for or not accounted for. So we do need to work towards answering the question about if it's embedded and gets into the program, or if it's somehow otherwise a not covered battery that gets into the program. How does that get taken care of? But currently the way that it would work is that the producers who are all part of that PRO would be responsible for paying for the cost of managing that battery, whether it was originally accounted for in the system or not. And then that accountability going back to make sure that all producers are contributing into the system and funding it. Which is kind of a big gray loophole of an answer. And if Brian, if you have more questions, go ahead and feel free to ask. But I do want to talk about our bill, and some of that might help to understand what all goes into the different considerations of how a program is going to run. So our approach on our bill, in Illinois, we don't have any existing battery legislation. We do have a lead acid battery requirement. So car batteries we were used to managing, but as far as any consumer batteries, household batteries, there hasn't been any program or legislation run for that previously. And we do have some limited collection of lithium ion batteries at our HHW facilities, but we don't have a lot of HHW facilities for as large of a state as we are, and you would expect to have a lot more. We have 102 counties, about 13 million people, and we have 5 permanent HHW sites, and most of those are in the Chicago area. So that isn't really a great option for folks. And then we have voluntary collections that are done through the retailers that are sponsored by Call to Recycle at places like Home Depot and Lowe's. that are somewhat promoted. Some people know about them. We've got Batteries Plus, we've got Staples stores that are doing these voluntary collections. But we, last year, in going through our planning with the Product Stewardship Council in Illinois and working with PSI, we were identifying what our legislative interests were for the coming years. We had just passed pharmaceuticals legislation the year prior in 2022. We passed paint last year in 23, and we've had an electronics EPR program for a long time, since 2008. And so batteries were one of the items that kind of leapt off the page because we knew that it was an industry issue for the waste and recycling industry, from fires and the risks that they were facing, as well as challenges that we had because we are constantly contacted as local governments by our residents asking, what do I do with this battery? I know it's not supposed to go in the garbage. Where am I supposed to put it? And not having convenient options. So we're fortunate in the Chicago metro area that we have a lot more options. My agency runs a program for battery collection, and we collect about 20,000 pounds of batteries a year. Through that program, we do handle all types of batteries, both primary and rechargeables, up to the small power pack type batteries like you would have on a drill or some handheld power tools. Anything larger than that, we have not handled. So for us, it was interesting to look at an option that would increase the service that we can provide not only to our own residents, but also then across the state. So we have a lot of areas that are have-not areas, and really don't have good access and never will have access short of someone being required to provide that service. We did start from Washington's bill that Leland talked about, and so a lot of the components of our bill are very similar to Washington. The reason we worked with Washington's bill is that in doing some of our initial research and talking with some of our stakeholders, there was a general acceptance that it was a reasonable bill. It did not have overly burdensome requirements and penalties for any of the participants. And it was much more driven towards achieving collection and doing it in a responsible way and doing it with a convenience standard that we favor for our collections here. In addition to working with the Product Stewardship Council, the NWRA Illinois chapter was very involved. They'd come to us and we were brainstorming already about how we could make this happen. And when Washington's bill passed, they did like it. And so we engaged PURBA and Call to Recycle to get their feedback on how they felt about the Washington bill. They were involved in that drafting. They were involved in its passage. There were things that they found in the Washington bill that were overly burdensome, things like eco-modulation and some of the requirements around island communities or some less accessible communities. And so we made some changes in our version of the bill that streamlined some of that. We also have some restrictions from our state EPA when they go to regulate and to administer the program and do the oversight that's necessary. They need good guidance of what passes and doesn't pass certain criteria when they're looking at things like plans and annual reports. So that caused us to be a lot more specific within our bill. And we also did not want to go through a rulemaking process. So our statute needed to be implementable from day one without having to develop rules, which some other states are having to do. We also worked with our Illinois Manufacturers Association representing producers, as well as the Illinois Retail Merchants Association, representing the retailers, many of whom we are hoping are going to serve as collection sites for batteries. We do not have a requirement for retailers to be collection sites, but they can be. Those two groups in our state they have a very powerful lobby. So if you do not have them on your side, you are not likely to advance your EPR legislation. We've learned that over the years of the different types of legislation that we've tried to pass. So we made sure to bring them to the table first thing. And it was very successful to do that. They found a lot of value in the approach that we took, not making it a burden on retailers, not making it a program that manufacturers are overly responsible for, aside from those that are producers of batteries, and with PURBA at the table representing those battery producers on a national level that helped to kind of appease our Manufacturers Association. So our bill was Senate Bill 3686. We had an identical bill in the House, but the Senate version is the one that carried through with all of the amendments. So that would be the one to take a look at. I've got a QR code at the end of this that'll have the link or that you can access to get the legislation. So our covered batteries, very similar again to what we've heard already. It's the portable and medium format, up to 25 pounds and 2,000 watt hours. It's both primary and rechargeable, all chemistries, all brands. We know that consumers are not going to be able to understand the differences. A lot of the batteries are not well labeled currently. There's labeling efforts that are, underway within the country, but we don't know what's going to come out of that. So simplifying this for the resident and for the consumer, just taking all chemistries and all brands is going to be valuable. We have our Consumer Electronics Recycling Act that does have inclusion of products that contain batteries. So things like laptops, tablets, those batteries would not be covered. They are covered under the Electronics Recycling Act. And we are not covering any embedded batteries. So it's only loose batteries that are easily removable from a device or a product. So those battery containing products, easily removable is a part of the definition of what makes it a battery containing product. And easily removable is intended to mean that it can be accessed with common household tools. So while you can remove an iPhone battery with, a couple of tools that are not necessarily common, or that you can pry it out with certain tools, it's not meant to be removed. So that battery is not a covered battery. We are going to have a study that the Battery Stewardship Organization will conduct to look at how to manage those embedded batteries. So all of these different studies are going to have slightly different due dates in the different states, but the thought is there's likely to be some collaboration to complete those. A lot of the other states have done it where the state agency is responsible for conducting that study. We put it on the Battery Stewardship Organization in order to be efficient with getting it completed and to take advantage of the national knowledge that they have of the different networks that may be available to manage those batteries. Our covered consumers are all consumers. So this is different than any of the other legislation that we have done for EPR in Illinois, which generally covers residential materials only. I guess paint would be the other exception, but that just passed last year, so we haven't fully implemented that. But our pharmaceuticals and our electronics bills are all geared towards residential. When we introduced packaging legislation, that was for primarily residential material. So this one, we do want to hit all consumers because we do want to make sure that we capture all of those batteries. We really looked at this being more of a health and safety bill than a recycling or environmental bill. And we use that to promote it with the legislators. We also do have a disposal ban, so you cannot discard batteries in recycling or waste containers beginning January 1st of 2028. And our program will start in 2026 for collection, but we did not want to introduce the ban until we had an opportunity for all of the collection site networks to be set up so that we don't have a ban without a network. So those convenience requirements are going to really drive how we're able to serve the state. So we didn't look at it as a certain number of sites, but we do have a radius basis for determining where sites need to be located. For portable batteries, we have to have a minimum of one permanent site within 15 miles of 95% of the state population. We have not mapped that to see what that looks like or what that means in terms of number of sites. We also have to have a site or a collection service or a collection event for every 30,000 residents of a county. We have 102 counties. Of those counties, 55 of them are under 30,000 people. So we have more than half of our counties, and a lot of those are in the southern part of the state, that are not going to have that additional site or service or event, but will still be covered by that requirement to have a minimum of one permanent site within a 15-mile radius. So those sites will likely be places like a township garage or a village hall, hopefully a retailer, but again, even the retailers that you may have to travel more than 15 miles to get to anyone from some areas of the state. Medium format batteries, we have a different requirement. We had a minimum of 10 permanent sites statewide, and they need to be geographically dispersed. And the reason for that lower number of sites is because those are a larger battery. They have specific handling requirements. They actually have to be handled more like a hazardous waste. So our HHW facilities will be locations for that. We will have to have some other sites set up in order to hit that geographic dispersion. And because we only have 5 permanent HHW sites in the state, there's going to need to be some expansion of that. And there has to be one site per county with 200,000 or more in population. So that's going to actually increase beyond that minimum of 10, just because of the number of counties that touches. Every county needs to have access to a collection for medium format batteries, whether it's at a collection event that would be like a one-day event, or a permanent site at least every 3 years. So these will be batteries that people will still likely have to hold on to a bit longer or have to travel further to be able to dispose of. And then we had performance standards that are set in the bill. So we have a recycling efficiency rate, which is the percent of the material that's in the collected batteries that actually gets recycled. So that rate was set at a minimum of 60% for rechargeable batteries and 70% for primary batteries. The battery industry has indicated that those are achievable rates. It still does give them, some pressure to manage those materials in recycling format, but also there are just components of the battery that they often cannot directly recycle. So it does allow them to maintain a efficient processing system. We have a collection rate, which is the percent of batteries that are generated that would be captured by the system, and that needs to be proposed by the stewardship organization in their plan. We did not set what that collection rate was within the bill. And then there is a public awareness standard. So there will be surveys of the public that are done annually and will be reported back to ensure that there is an understanding within the public of the existence of this requirement and how you can access disposal or discard sites for batteries. And finally, the producer responsibilities. They have to join a battery stewardship organization. There can be more than one battery stewardship organization, but any battery stewardship organization must meet all requirements of a stewardship organization under the bill. So if two separate stewardship organizations file plans or intend to register plans, they each have to provide the same convenience standard. If they want to be collaborative, they can do that, but they would have to then report up as a single stewardship organization. They'll submit a plan that documents how the program requirements are going to be met, and then they're going to fund all of the costs for battery collection, transport, recycling, and end-of-life management, education, outreach, annual reporting, and agency administration. So we have a fixed cost of $100,000 for agency administration per battery stewardship organization. So again, if we have more than one, the cost for our agency to administer it will be the same because they're reviewing another plan, they're reviewing annual reports, they are looking at sites that are out there for collection. And those stewardship organizations need to start their collections by January 1st of 2026. And then they're responsible for meeting the performance goals and achieving the recycling efficiency and collection targets. We have now seen our bill get introduced in Connecticut and in Pennsylvania, and I think one other state on the East Coast, that it was essentially the same format. HRBA really liked the revisions that were made from the Washington bill. We have never introduced a bill in Illinois that made it through on EPR, that made it through in a single session, let alone in one half of a session. We have a biennial session, so we were in the second half, and it is an election year, so things were a bit abbreviated and kept to high focus, and we made it through with success all in 1 year. So it's a testament to the stakeholders all being engaged and being supportive that the program is accepted by the industry. Was a big deal for us to be able to get that done this year. There's the QR code if you want to scan it to get access to the bill. That'll be the enrolled version. We do expect the governor to sign it. He has about another 3 weeks to get it signed. But our process just takes a while, and we are hosting the Democratic National Convention here in Chicago in a couple of weeks. So he is a little distracted, and we're just waiting for him to pick up a pen. We'd really like to do a bill signing ceremony, but I think it's going to be a matter of him signing a stack of bills one day, and it'll pop up as signed. So I'm happy to take any questions.
Oh,
now
my
or later.
goodness, Christina. Well, let's briefly, if you don't mind, addressing Brian's question about, do you have right to repair? Since we have right to repair in Colorado, we're very curious how that intersects with your legislation.
We do not have right to repair in Illinois yet. we have had discussions around that because we were approached by a company that does repair phones, for example, and they were questioning how the system would work. So they're actually an organization that's a member of PURBA. PURBA is working with them because it's an issue not just in Illinois, but in other states as well, of how repaired batteries or repaired devices that contain batteries would be impacted. Our initial thought right now on phones is that the battery itself in most cell phones is not designed to be removed by the consumer. So you do have repair shops that will be able to access it, but they usually have to have a special tool, or by removing it as a consumer, you may be voiding your warranty on the phone. So that essentially makes it a non-covered battery. That would then mean that the battery still gets managed by the repair shop through other means. You know, they can still access the same processors in the same type of network. It's just not funded by the battery producer in that instance. What we have talked about with some folks is, as right to repair becomes more prevalent, and if there are product redesigns that we see that ripple across the entire product space, and now cell phone batteries again become removable, you know, back when they used to just be the pop-off battery off the back of a phone, I could see that coming back. In that instance, they would become a covered battery, and then they would be reported and paid for through the system. So the producer would be the producer of the phone or the producer of the battery if that's assigned to them and accepted by them and reported to the stewardship organization. So there's a chain of reporting that has to happen to track all of these batteries as they enter the system, so that they are, as they're leaving the system, there can be a confirmation that in fact they were funded from the start.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I very much appreciate how much work you all have all done to make such a short presentation with such dense information. Thank you. We should have time at the end for an open Q&A if our panelists don't mind hanging on. But for the moment, we're going to look even further north to our neighbors up in Canada and ask Jodi to talk to us about how this works in Canada and what are some of the lessons we might learn here in Colorado. While Jodi is figuring that out, I will.
I am so sorry.
There she is.
Yeah, can you guys see my screen? Yes. Okay, wonderful. Sorry about that. Everything went blank, even though I prepared ahead of time. So I am up here in Canada. I'm just an independent consultant, and I was asked to give you a cross-country kind of view of what is happening here with hazardous and special products regulation across the country. And we'll just go to the next slide. So I'm just going to leave this up. I'm not going to go through these acronyms. It's just a reference for you if you ever want to refer back to this presentation. I'll be using the full names as I speak to you. So just a bit of setting the context. Across Canada, we do have 13 separate jurisdictions, and the authority to regulate solid waste in those jurisdictions rests with the provinces and territories. A little different than what Leland said, we do have all but 2 of the jurisdictions now, Nunavut and Northwest Territories, with some form of hazardous and special products regulated. In general, though, it's important for context from what Liz had told me for you to understand that in Canada, the provinces and territories where there isn't a jurisdiction-wide program regulated, they have usually delegated that responsibility down to the local governments, and the local governments, by and large, are providing some form of HSP collection. So just another little bit more of setting the stage. As a result, most of the urban centers across Canada do have permanent eco depots, and the rural and remote areas tend to have some form of collection events that are covered and paid for by the local governments. These depots usually do service all residents, so not just the curbside residents, but also multi-residential residents. And in many cases, they also serve small business and some element of the industrial, commercial, and institutional sector. So one important thing, you guys asked me to talk about HHW, but I'm here talking to you about HSP. Well, what the heck is HSP? Well, hazardous and special products, it's a different way of regulating. So instead of regulating the source of the waste, you're regulating the waste itself. So the newer regulations in Canada are now all referring to hazardous and special products, and it's the more dated regulations that are referring to household hazardous waste. The HSP, even though it is regulating the waste, there still may be limits on what is regulated. So the quantity of what is accepted at the depots may be regulated. So it's very common, for instance, for corrosives, toxics, and flammables to be limited to 10 liters or 10 kilograms. And I've got the conversions down below for you American folks. There's lots of decimals in those conversions. They may also be limited to just servicing small businesses, or they may service the entire HHW, the entire IC&I sector. You'll also see across, if you're looking at our regulations and you're trying to figure out what's what, you're going to see the terms HSP, HHW, but you'll also see in British Columbia, they use the term residuals. So what is HSP? Well, it really varies by province and territory. Where hazardous and special products are regulated, they almost always contain corrosives, flammables, domestic pesticides, and toxics, although in British Columbia, they don't regulate the corrosive element. But those provinces and territories may also include other elements, other materials under their HSP regulation. So Ontario includes fertilizers, for example. Alberta and the Yukon Territory, which just passed the most recent regulations, include batteries. Paint may be included, pressurized cylinders, pharmaceuticals, and medical sharps. Lighting might be included, both the lamps and the ballasts, as well as other mercury-containing devices such as alarms, mercury switches, thermostats, and lamps. And of course, used automotive fluids, aerosols, filters, and their containers. So HSP and HHW, the way they are differentiated in regulation is HSP generally refers to a federal regulation called the Commercial Chemical and Containers Regulation. And in those cases, the things that are part of the system, part of the paid producer funded part of the system, would have to have one of these symbols on it. For HHW, it's a bit more general, and they refer to a CSA standard for that definition. So here's the story that Liz really wanted me to relay to you. And that is that HSP regulation has grown over the last 30 years. We started out in the early days regulating paint. So British Columbia in 1994 was the first jurisdiction to regulate extended producer responsibility for paint. But as of today, all the provinces and territories, except Northwest Territories and Nunavut, now have some form of paint and paint container regulation. As well, EPR and or product stewardship, it's really just a fine line of who's carrying out the program. Those programs began in 1997, but again, all of the provinces and territories except Nunavut and Northwest Territories now have some form of automotive fluid, filter, and container regulation. The difference is really the expanse of each of those programs. So in Alberta, we're still limited to used oil materials, whereas the broadest programs now include diesel exhaust fluid, antifreeze, and used oil materials, both in container form and in aerosol form. We really started to regulate HSP as a bucket in British Columbia in 1997. So that didn't discount everything they had regulated before, it just added to those materials. But now we do have HSP proper regulations from British Columbia. If you go west, east in Canada, from British Columbia through Ontario, and now in the Yukon Territory. We also have battery regulations. The interesting thing about battery regulation Canada-wide is we really have had voluntary battery collection across much of Canada with or without regulation. Call to Recycle has been providing those services. But what has really pushed battery regulation in the last few years is Call to Recycle stopped providing voluntary services because the cost of battery recycling got more expensive. And so that's really pushed jurisdictions in now including either regulating batteries separately or including them as part of HSP. And so now we have regulated battery collection systems from British Columbia in the west right through Quebec, as well as in Prince Edward Island and the Yukon Territory. For lead acid batteries, there's fewer programs across Canada, but they do exist. They exist in British Columbia, Manitoba, Prince Edward Island, and the Yukon. And finally, pharmaceuticals and sharps, they are now being regulated as HSP materials. And those the provinces with those regulations are British Columbia, Manitoba, Ontario, Quebec, New Brunswick, and Prince Edward Island. So you're really starting to see the expanse of all of those materials coming under some form of HSP regulation. So when you're regulating hazardous and special waste, one of the really important things to consider is who you're going to regulate. In Canada, generally, it's typically the brand owner, importer, retailer, but most of those regulations do allow for voluntary reporting. But what's interesting is the most recent regulations for HSP are starting with that cascade at the brand owner level of having residency in Canada, not just in the province or territory that's being regulated. And what that's doing is it's reducing the number of producers that are regulated because they have to, the highest level has to report into the system. And you can just see the differences in how that producer definition is between these two examples here in Alberta and Ontario. So what is targeted? Some considerations to make as you're moving forward with your regulations. What is targeted? What is the basket of materials that you are going to look at as part of the system? As you can tell across Canada, it's quite varied. Which generators are you going to cover? Are you just going to cover the households, or are you also going to cover small business? In the Yukon, they're covering, for instance, households and small business. If you're going to cover the entire automotive, the entire IC&I sector, which is very common across Canada, it's the entire generating sector, IC&I and residential, for the used automotive materials as well as for paint containers. Also, you want to really think about what's required by the system operator. Are you going to require a regulated outcome of accessibility targets? Are you going to require regulated outcome for collection targets, as well as management targets and promotion and education? And you can see this is just an example from Ontario about how those requirements differ based on the material that's regulated. Considerations for HSP specifically, when you regulate HSP, all of the materials that are collected, or if your municipality already has an HHW depot, it's likely that all of the materials that they collect would not be covered as part of the program. As a result, the local governments that have HHW collection, that broader mix of materials, will probably still be needed. And if the local governments under an HSP regulation obviously don't have to continue to provide service, but they very well may like to do that, just to continue to collect that broader range of materials. But if they're going to do that, they have to realize that only a portion of the materials that they collect would be subsidized by the HSP regulated system. And what they do in Canada to figure that out is usually some form of lab pack analysis where they're making an estimate of the regulated versus non-regulated material that's covered. There's a list of materials here that are typically excluded from all regulations across Canada. And you can see that these are things that municipalities would collect. If you're cleaning out your garage, you may have a load of Drano or insect repellent or pool chemicals or pet products or insecticidal soap sitting in that garage, and those things end up somewhere. And in Canada, at least, most of the municipalities want to make sure that those continue to be diverted to responsible places. So there's an example here from Ontario. The HSP regulation there covers 11% of the domestic pesticides, 7% of the miscellaneous organics, including solvents, and 51% of the aerosols that municipalities are getting in their system. Whoops. Considerations for batteries. Batteries are really easy to regulate in terms of definition. Having said that, small sealed lead acid batteries can be controversial. The industry did a really good job of lobbying to keep that out of Alberta's program, but they are in all of the other programs across Canada. Embedded batteries are also something to think about. They're typically excluded from battery programs in Canada because they are already included in the electrical and electronic device programs in the province or territory where they're regulated. The exception being that Quebec and soon British Columbia are choosing now to regulate batteries that are difficult to remove from products. So those are embedded batteries, but they're not typically thought of as e-waste. And so the examples are the vapes and e-cigarettes that we've been talking about, but also those tiny little silly candles and batteries and cards and things like that. So Quebec has put a list in their regulation of the embedded batteries that are actually the responsibility of the battery producers. Also, a bigger issue kind of growing in Canada right now are damaged, defective, and recalled batteries. These are batteries that need special handling by municipalities, and there needs to be some special thinking around that. What is not regulated across Canada right now are EV batteries. They aren't regulated by any of the jurisdictions, though we expect Canada and British Columbia to be the first to the gate regulating those. One other thing to think about with batteries is that for consumer batteries, you will need some kind of public drop-off site. But for IC&I generated batteries, those can be collected right where they are generated. So there is no reason why a collection box can't be, in the back of an industrial shop somewhere and sent in as that box gets filled. Just overall, kind of some take-home messages to think about for both batteries specifically and for HSP more generally. Municipalities, especially those in British Columbia, are more and more expecting and understanding what extended producer responsibility is, and that their full costs, that producers should be responsible for the full costs and not whatever subsidization they want to provide to HHW depots. And so there are some municipalities that are saying, I don't want to operate my depot anymore. I'm going to step away. Producer, it's your responsibility to bring this in. And it's forcing the provinces to come back and have conversations and force the accessibility requirements in those jurisdictions. There's also no field of dreams in terms of if you build it, they will come. You can't just plunk battery boxes all over a province and expect those batteries to be collected. That has to be promoted. There's the classic, I have 100 boxes out in this community and they're all in some back room somewhere and nobody knows they exist. So making sure that not only accessibility is tied to awareness targets and tied to promotion and education. And in general, target setting can be challenging, especially for collection and management. So what you're going to hear from everybody is the fewer or the less HSP you get back, the better, because that just means people are using up what they buy, and those containers are then being properly managed through a packaging program. And that just we know that's not always the case. We also don't know through our HSP programs across Canada, there isn't great reporting on there's great reporting on the fact that the containers there's a weight recycled, but you have no idea what the percentage or the collection rate on the actual containers are, aside from what the product management. For batteries, there are targets across the Canadian programs that include collection rate and accessibility targets, as well as promotion and education. We don't see that again with the HSP because of the BUD rule, the use it up rule. Where there are collection rate targets, they tend to begin around 20 to 40% with expected growth over time. And we know that there's growing consequences. There's growing attention to battery collection and recycling just because of the problems with lithium secondary batteries, especially in the waste stream. For hazardous and special products, those targets tend to be focusing on accessibility only. And I already mentioned for containers, there's very little transparency on container collection, but we are seeing more and more that there's agreements between producer responsibility organizations for the HSP system and the pharmaceuticals collection system and the packaging and paper product system, so that those containers can be collected at curbside under an agreement. So that is my very high level, very rapid overview of what is happening in Canada, but happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Jodi. Oh my goodness, you packed a lot in there.
It's a big country.
I don't see any questions, but one of the things I am curious about is, do you have any insight into that slide that you showed where it was the progression of EPR tackling various material streams? Yeah. Do you know why that was the progression and why consumer batteries came after HSP and before pharmaceuticals?
Yeah, so, 30 years ago when these programs started, there was a lot of awareness about used oil and about paint and making sure that those materials were handled properly. So there was national attention to making sure that, there was collection opportunities for those materials. British Columbia, they started, but they were also the leaders in extended producer responsibility in Canada. So you see their first regulation was in 1997. What happened just before 2010 was there was a group called the Canadian Councils of Ministers for the Environment. It is where the provinces and territories get together to discuss best practices across all manner of things, but solid waste management being one of them. And there was an EPR roadmap that was generated at the time. I actually sat on that committee, so that's how long ago that was. And so there was a list of materials that was created, and that has been updated over the years. And hazardous and special products was identified as one of the things that should be a target of extended producer responsibility, understanding that EPR, the purpose of EPR is to move the costs of collection and operation from taxpayers to producers and their consumers. So it's one of the most expensive waste management programs that municipalities provide, and that is a great opportunity to move the costs away from taxpayers towards producers. So that's when we really started seeing the regulations start to explode. So this is a nice diagram to show when it started, but the explosion of HSP regulation has really happened in the last 5 years.
And did I hear you correctly that these regulations, although they were passed back in 2010, 2011, 2014, they have continued to be modified? They continue to get updated, modernized?
Absolutely. So the at the top, you can see where the first regulation, the first jurisdiction to pass a regulation is, but the regulations on the regulations in all the other provinces and territories have continued to learn from those initial regulations. So what we've really seen is that there is this movement away from just HHW to regulating the material. There is a move to away from regulating individual materials to regulating HSP as a bucket. So the most recent regulations in Alberta and in the Yukon Territory have that wider bucket of materials in them, including batteries. Whereas we used to have a material by material specific approach before, we're starting to move to more a bulked approach for HSP. And that's just for regulatory efficiency. But I think one of the important things when Liz and you and I chatted, what you had said was like, hey, there's not a lot of HHW depots around our state. That's not the case in Canada. Most of the local governments in Canada, especially the major local governments, do have those HSP depots. Most of the rural and remote areas do have some form of collection event, even if it's only a collection event, a couple of days a year. They are providing or have provided historically the opportunity for Canadians to make sure that they're managing those materials appropriately. In some parts of Canada, like British Columbia, Nova Scotia, Quebec, there are stronger regulations. They're either backed by disposal bans or they're backed by a requirement for solid waste management planning that the local governments have to provide some kind of option for those materials. So I think, there's different kind of pushers, there's different kind of reasons why each of the provinces went when they did. But there is definitely a movement in the last 5 years to make sure that the provinces are moving towards harmonization as much as possible, regulating the same materials across the jurisdictions as much as possible, recognizing that every province likes to be a snowflake. Every jurisdiction in Canada likes to be a snowflake and do something just a little bit different.
Well, we share that uniqueness here in the lower 48 and our neighbors in the Pacific. We all think of ourselves as very special and we like to tweak it just a little bit. It was very exciting to hear from Christina that some other states have taken what Illinois did so that as we move forward, perhaps we can get a little bit more harmonization, because I absolutely have appreciation for how challenging it must be as a producer that is selling into multiple states and countries to align with these various specific regulations. So yeah. Thank you. If you don't mind staying on, we'll have some time for larger the larger group questions at the end. But for the moment, I will turn it over to Nick and ask Nick to talk to us about California.
Hey, everybody. This has been so informative, by the way. Thank you for putting this together. Let me share my screen. All right, can folks see that? So again, my name is Nick Lapis. I'm with Californians Against Waste. We are an environmental organization based in Sacramento. Been around since the late 70s, work on waste reduction, recycling policy more broadly. Most people think of us as the bottle bill organization. So that's sort of what we were founded around back in the late 70s, but we work on a variety of issues, including HHW issues and organics and plastics and all sorts of other things. And I'll say I'm focused on batteries here. We do have a lot of other legislation that I've heard mentioned in California as well. We have a paint program, a few others that I could answer questions about, or at least direct you to the right person if you have questions. So my focus again is on batteries, and we kind of did something a little bit weird in California. We didn't pass one bill. We passed two companion bills, one for loose batteries, one for battery embedded products. And then I also added in our recent right to repair law as well, because I think it's relevant to the conversation. So starting with, so the two companion bills, the first was AB 2440. Sorry, let me go back. First was AB 2440, which was the EPR program for loose batteries. And then SB 1215 is the expansion of our e-waste law to cover battery embedded products. And they were companion bills. They were an issue we worked on together for many years, and at the very last minute decided to split it into two bills. A lot of the genesis for the interest in battery legislation in California came from the MRF operators and the local governments who've had to deal with fires resulting from improper disposal of batteries. The video you see running at the bottom right-hand corner, or you should see running, is a MRF literally catching on fire from a lithium-ion battery. I think it kind of helps put into context, this hypothetical situation of, well, how does, we all know the batteries cause fires, blah, 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 but really, I think this kind of makes it obvious that the way a MRF works, once something catches on fire, it spreads out the entire facility. Entire facility is up in smoke very, very quickly. And so we had a massive fire in San Carlos at a MRF that's run by a public agency called Rethink Waste. It's the South Bayside Waste Management Authority. The MRF burned down. There were some firefighter injuries. The cleanup was very, very expensive. Rebuilding the MRF was very expensive. And they had a couple subsequent fires as well. And sort of the breaking point for them was that their insurer basically told them that if they have another fire, they're not going to be able to be insured at all for the facility. And that really had them reach out to us and California Product Stewardship Council, and we ended up co-sponsoring the legislation with the South Bayside Waste Management Authority, with Rethink Waste. So our three organizations worked together on it, and our framing was really around fires. In addition to this very high-profile MRF fire, we've had a bunch of them all over the state. I remember calling around asking a MRF operator how many if they've ever had a fire, and he said, I think we've had 30 this year. And so I think it's a lot more prevalent than people realize. We also had one of our massive wildfires in the state started by a battery. It was a battery inside a garbage truck that caught on fire. The garbage truck had to dump the load on the road, and that started one of our largest wildfires in the state. That was really our framing all along. Like somebody else said, it's not about recycling. It's not about the environment. It's about health and safety. So the first bill is sort of more along the lines of what you've heard from other folks. It's a somewhat traditional manufacturer-run EPR program for loose batteries. It took us several years to get the legislation passed. I want to say 5 or 6 years. So we went through several iterations. We debated the scope. We considered first rechargeable batteries, and then we considered primary, and then we considered primary and rechargeable. We considered different chemistries, and we basically decided that people are going to put everything into the bin. If you put out a bin, they're going to put everything in. And we realized even among the supporters that we didn't really understand the difference sometimes between what is a lithium-ion battery versus a lithium polymer battery, et cetera. And so this is more or less a traditional EPR program. I didn't want to be duplicative of what other folks said, so I'm not going to go through the basics of how it works with the an advisory committee and a budget and a plan, 5-year updates and all that. But I do want to highlight some specifics that are unique to California, or at least things that I think are interesting. This is the scope of the bill. Like you see, it's actually really, really broad. So it covers everything. There was a lot of pushback on including button cell batteries because they are so commonly used. But we included them. There was a lot of pushback on, well, every part of it, as you can imagine. But it's just a very broad definition. The part of the bill that I think is the single coolest part that I don't believe anybody else has replicated, but I strongly encourage everybody else to replicate, is we put in an explicit retailer take-back mandate into the bill. So what the legislation says is that any retailer that has 5 or more locations that sells batteries has to provide consumer take-back of the batteries. And if you start thinking about the scope of retailers with 5 or more locations, you basically end up covering all the supermarket chains, all the gas station chains, all the big box retailers. It's a pretty large universe of retailers that are going to offer collection. And that collection has to be free for consumers and free for the retailer. We've noticed some other programs, whenever a consumer has to pay a fee to drop something off, they won't. I think that probably is obvious to everybody on the line. The free for retailers was pretty contentious. There's a lot of political back and forth there, but it basically came down to, we believe the manufacturer should be responsible for the cost of collecting this. Occasionally the manufacturer is the retailer, but in whether or not they are, they need to provide it to the retailer for free. We also include a convenience standard, which is kind of a more conventional part of an EPR program. In my mind, this is sort of a fallback on the retailer collection mandate. In most cases, the retailer collection mandate will cover the convenience standard, but we have some counties that are very rural in California. And there's a chance that there might not be sufficient retailers with 5 or more locations operating in that county. And so in that case, we want to fall back so that, even the most rural parts of the state still have access. We went kind of back and forth on how to measure it, what standard to use. Our various EPR programs all have different convenience standards. They are all measured differently. I don't think we have found the one right answer, but this made sense for us. We did not like the distance, the 15-mile radius that was suggested by several folks in the industry. Just realistically looking at, kind of going the other extreme away from the rural counties, looking at Los Angeles, 15 miles could be a 2-hour drive. And so it just didn't really make sense for us. We put in a recycling efficiency rate, and it was presented in one of the other presentations as well. We didn't put too much meat on the bone. It's more or less just this, but we did decide to include that. So on to the other bill, SB 1215 by Senator Newman. And the two bills passed at the same time, were signed on the same day. And what the Newman bill did was expand our existing e-waste law to cover all battery embedded products. So let me see, I actually think I might have put these out of order. I did. So we had an existing e-waste law. The bill is actually fairly simple. It had covered electronic devices. We changed that from a covered electronic device means something with a monitor to a covered electronic device means something with a monitor or anything with a battery or any battery embedded product. And then battery embedded product is defined pretty broadly as a product containing a battery from which the battery is not designed to be easily removed from the product by the user with no more than common use household tools. The way our e-waste law works, this is a 2003 law, is that there's a fee on consumers that's set by the state. And the state determines what the fee is based on the cost of recycling the products. Consumer pays the fee, and then recyclers get paid by weight for how much they recycle. It's been a pretty effective law, pretty effective system. We had almost overnight elimination of legal dumping of monitors and other things after the passage of the bill. But the fact that it was so reliant on weight made it really hard to account for the switch to electronics being much lighter, especially since it was based on monitors and CRTs, TVs, and all those switched from gigantic heavy items to much thinner, lighter ones. And so this will also help the long-term viability of that program by expanding the scope to all other electronics. Again, this is a consumer-facing fee. The program is run by the state. It is not an EPR program. I'm not going to go through the exclusions from the bills. They're up here, so you can read them and I can answer any questions. I figured there might be questions around it, so I put up a slide I could go back to. Some of the notable ones are we exempted lead acid batteries, which were actually covered by a separate bill the year before. I probably should have added a slide on that. Motor vehicles are exempt, a few other things as well. And then, like I said, there are actually kind of three bills, right? Because there were the two battery bills, and then the following year we passed right to repair, which was also a 5-year effort. Took a lot of back and forth. There's a lot to it, and I could keep talking about it forever by limiting myself to 2 slides, just so I don't forget to mention it. And the reason I thought it was important to include in this conversation is that a lot of preventable battery waste comes from devices that can be very easily fixed. When somebody breaks their screen on their phone, it's much cheaper for them to just get a new phone and toss it, even if there's nothing else wrong with it. If you can repair the screen, you generate less waste to begin with. And even though it is this broad concept of right to repair, it kind of just boils down to manufacturers have to provide tools and parts and diagnostic equipment to the public and to third-party repair shops at the same cost that they provided to their own authorized repair. That's the entirety of the bill. A lot of nuances in terms of retroactivity and other things, but that's kind of what it boils down to. And we co-sponsored this bill. The previous 2 bills we co-sponsored with California Product Stewardship Council and Rethink Waste, and we co-sponsored this with CalPERG and iFixit. What I think is missing, or what's coming up, are glaring holes that are still left, depending how you look at it. A big one is electric vehicle batteries. They were not covered under the bill. Actually, some question about that, but I largely think that they were not covered. We did pass a bill a few years ago creating a task force to come up with recommendations for EV batteries. That report came out, covering that all my part of the screen, March 2022. And there's a bill moving through the legislature now that would create an EPR program for EV batteries. Not clear if it's going to pass yet. It's in the Appropriations Committee towards the end of the process. Another thing that's come up repeatedly on the call so far has been vapes and e-cigarettes. We definitely think that's a priority. A large number of the disposable batteries come with disposable vapes. There was a bill that almost made it a few years ago that would have banned the sale of disposable vapes altogether. We hope to bring that back at some point. The National Stewardship Action Council sponsored that bill, but we're hoping to bring that back and either look at a ban or potentially some kind of deposit or an EPR program. Kind of a lot of options on the table, but definitely a priority for us. And I did want to mention there's also a HHW EPR, comprehensive HHW EPR program that's pending in the legislature. It's also in the Assembly Appropriations Committee. And so we will know by the end of the summer if both the EV bill and the HHW bill are going to move to the governor's desk or not. I think that's it. As my contact information, a photo of my son, and I can answer any questions.
Thank you so much, Nick. My goodness. Is it CAW? Is that your acronym?
You know, people keep trying to make that happen. And it just never sticks. CAW never sticks. We usually just go by CAW, but
Well, what an amazing amount of work CAW has been up to. We've got a couple of questions in the chat, and I will encourage folks to put more questions in the Q&A. I've got a number of questions, but I don't want to monopolize the question time. Brian had asked about phones. He's saying phones generally run $200 or more for a new phone, and a screen can be replaced for $125 on average. Did you study the cost of phones as you considered that right to repair?
not especially, but the way the law is written is that, let's just use Apple as an example. They will have to now, actually, it went into effect a couple weeks ago. So they now have to offer phones to the general public at the same price that they offer them to their authorized repairers. So whether it's the Apple Store or Best Buy. And I believe that would be significantly less than $125.
Thank you. And then Brian had another interesting question that I think would be good for, I'm going to kick it to Leland first because you seem to have, he says, what? Leland and then Jodi. Have you, in any of your studies of the laws that have been on the books, has there been an impact on how products are made? Meaning there's been a tendency to use more recyclable materials or less embedded batteries? Have any of the legislative acts that have been in place for a number of years, has there been an impact on production? I'll ask Leland first.
Sure.
And then
Well, the battery programs in the US are very new, especially when it comes in regards to embedded battery. And the idea of eco-modulation is extremely new in the US and globally as well. So the impact of that, I don't think there's a good, analysis that would say, yes, it's changed, the impact. There's been some specific products, where you think like mercury thermostats or things like that, where programs, whether it's EPR program or just regulations have definitely been phased out. So I don't know if you could say we have had those discussions in some of our groups. One, approach is to include embedded batteries in a program, and another is to basically stipulate they have to be removable. And of course, industries don't like it whenever you, kind of dictate design to them as well. So I think it's still a conversation. I don't think, especially in the world of batteries, you're going to find an example of how it's changed a product's design yet. I don't know, Jodi, if what you think from the Canadian experience, there are older programs there.
Older programs, but Canada is less than 1% of the market. So I think I don't think anything Canada would do would necessarily affect the design of a battery. That technology is changing far too quickly. But I do think that Canada tagging onto programs and regulating in the same manner that's happening in the EU, start to get signals coming from all different areas of the world. That starts to send a stronger signal to producers overall. I will say that I think there has been a shift in lighting. Has Canada been responsible for that? No, not at all. I would doubt. But I think that growing EPR regulation, especially around mercury-containing devices, is having an impact on on spurring innovation in those areas.
I can also touch on this for a second. We obviously, our program is too new to know if it's going to affect the design, but we were really worried about only handling loose batteries and then encouraging people to glue in batteries so they are not subject to the law. So that was actually one of the main reasons why we really pushed to do both at the same time. I think it would have been easier just to do batteries, but in the case of California, we're a gigantic market for most folks. And so we were worried that it would lead to an obvious loophole of, well, now I'll just glue it in. I don't have to pay for the EPR program. And as soon as that's the case, you're disincentivizing repair in addition to creating a loophole.
And I think that's a good point. So in Canada, right across the country, I think in every jurisdiction except for Nunavut, there's some form of e-waste regulation, and those regulations are expanding on almost a monthly basis, depending on where you're looking. And so they're including more and more materials under the e-waste regulation. So whether that's small appliances or drills and things that require batteries, those producers will be caught under one or the other, and they can be, in many of the jurisdictions, they can be chosen to be serviced by either the e-waste pro or the battery pro. And in some places, there's competitive systems between the battery pro and the e-waste pro. So if you look at British Columbia, you've got Call to Recycle competing with EPRA for some of the same batteries. And so I don't think we would see that gluing in of batteries in Canada, because you're caught one way or the other under one of those regulatory frameworks.
Thank you. Another question I have, and I'm going to start with Christina and then ask Jen to also weigh in. One of the things each of you discussed is your legislation leads to a landfill ban. And in Colorado, we frequently get pushback because there's a resistance among legislators to impose punishment on citizens, on individuals. So I am curious, each of you spoke about there being a landfill ban component. Could you speak to how that would be enforced on the individual level? What would the enforcement of that ban look like? And I'll start with Christina.
So our bill, it's funny because we crossed our fingers that it wouldn't come up during the legislative process. We have a ban that is with no penalty, provided that there is signage at the waste facility that they do not accept loose batteries. So they won't knowingly accept them. If they're in waste that someone has thrown out, there is no penalty to that individual. So it's this really strange sort of a ban that is a ban of words and not so much a real penalty associated with failing to not segregate your batteries. The best that we had as an answer to that, if it had come up as a question, and what I would say is there's a public awareness component that is a big piece of the battery stewardship organization's responsibility to demonstrate that they're increasing public awareness and understanding of the program, and that they're providing access to the program. So every battery that we can remove from the waste stream or the recycling stream is going to, be one less battery that can cause a fire. We really want to push that awareness piece. We actually started an awareness campaign in the state before we even introduced the legislation on our own, just as basically mostly members of the Product Stewardship Council, and wanting to make sure that people understand the dangers. But yeah, there's no penalty, so it's a difficult thing to call a ban. It's banned, but you're not penalized if you end up putting it in the garbage, unless you're a waste facility or a recycling facility that intentionally accepts them or knowingly accepts them. But because they're such small items, it's very difficult to see.
So yeah, in Vermont, we have landfill bans on a lot of materials, recyclables, food scraps, household hazardous waste, batteries, tires. And the language, the way that it's written into statute for all of this is that no person shall knowingly dispose of the following materials, and it lists the materials. So it specifically is not on transfer stations, the landfill itself. It's more on the generator, and it's really seen as a way to get people aware and to use the special collection programs that are in place, and to tell them that they don't really have a choice. But there is no enforcement. The agency does not enforce that on individuals at all. It's just there for consumers to know that they're supposed to be separating these materials from their regular trash.
Well, that is a good and bad answer, to be sure. It means that with that information that would alleviate some concerns, but it shows that there's a ban and no enforcement, which how effective is that going to be? But to Nick's point earlier, if you make disposal convenient and easy, that takes care a lot. That takes care a lot of that. I realize we only have a couple minutes left, but Nick, you mentioned something that I thought was really important. Is your legislation requires retail drop-off locations, and based on what I heard from Christina, what I've heard in our own state in previous conversations, is I'm guessing that was a bit of a struggle. That must have been an extended negotiation. Could you give us some quick insight into how you were able to include that and get it passed?
I just kept showing photos of my son until they caved. No, it's a back and forth. I mean, I don't, there are 50 people on the line who I don't know, so I don't know how much we want to get into back and forth. But definitely a big part of that was that it has to be a no cost to the retailers. That was a big component. And then there are some other political dynamics that I can talk through with anybody one-on-one.
Yeah,
But-
and I would say from
Yeah.
Illinois' side of intentionally not requiring it of retailers, part of that is the retail association having such an entrenched position when it comes to lobbying that we just know that it's a non-starter. But beyond that, there were concerns about changing building code regulations that would impact the ability of some retail locations to functionally manage batteries because of the how the fire codes are required to, where you can collect them and where you can store them, and having all of the appropriate access and egress requirements. So there, from a battery standpoint specifically, to obligate someone to collect them could have been almost shooting ourselves in the foot for the fact that they may not have been able to comply. So that was another reason, but ultimately it was from the get-go, we knew that we weren't going to require the retailers to collect. We do know Call Recycle has a good relationship with a lot of retailers to serve as collectors, including ones that we feel like have a good presence across the state. So provided that relationship is still, it sustains, we should have a good number of sites right off the bat that will sign up to be collectors. So that we didn't feel that we needed to require the retailers to do it, but I do see value. And if you have the opportunity to do something like that, I think there's some value. People are going to buy a new battery to replace a battery that has, died or, is no longer functional. So might as well take it with them to the same place that they're buying it from.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and in Vermont,
Oh.
we allowed, we required the producers to allow any retailer that sells batteries to opt into the program. So that was a way of, we don't have convenience standards. We've found that for the most part, we do in some areas, but we have found that that kind of language with the retailers opting in, that's provided more than enough access for the public to drop off their batteries, because many retailers do participate.
Well, thank you all. Thank you for going a couple minutes over. I cannot express enough how grateful we are. This was so illuminating. I've got pages of notes here. Thank you for being here. Thank you to all of our attendees. We will post this recording and send out a link to the recording to everyone who attended, and we'll have a link to that on our webpage as well. Thank you so much. Enjoy the rest of your day, and let's move forward with protecting the environment and recycling more. Thank you.